are going to want to talk directly to Sessions himself about it.
Athena, on the heels of this Comey testimony, another former Justice Department employee that was fired by Trump is going public about his interactions with the president. What is he saying?
Right, you're talking about Preet Bharara, who was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, fired by President Trump a couple of months ago. On ABC's This Week, he talks about private conversations he had with then-candidate Trump that made him uncomfortable. Watch.
So he called me in December, ostensibly just to shoot the breeze and asked me how I was doing and wanted to make sure I was okay. It was similar to what Jim Comey testified to with respect to a call he got when he was getting on the helicopter. I didn't say anything at the time to him. It was a little bit uncomfortable, but he was not the president. He was only the president-elect. He called me again 2 days before the inauguration, again, seemingly to check in and shoot the breeze. And then he called me a third time when after he became president, and I refused to return the call. And in reporting the phone call to the Chief of Staff, to the Attorney General, I said it appeared to be that he was trying to cultivate some kind of relationship.
And what Bharara says there echoes what Jim Comey has had to say, although Comey described the dinner he had with the president as he thought it was an attempt to establish some sort of patronage relationship. Bharara was asked if he felt the same way about his conversations with then-candidate Trump, and he stopped short of saying that he thought there'd be sort of a patronage relationship, but he did believe the president, or the president-elect, I should say, was trying to establish some sort of relationship that made Bharara uncomfortable. So it's interesting to see that there's a suggestion of a pattern here of the president doing things that are inappropriate when it comes to Justice Department officials. Boris?
And according to him, he was fired after refusing that third phone call and reporting it the next day. Athena Jones, thank you very much. Let's discuss with our panel. Joining me now, CNN legal analyst Michael Zeldin. He's a former federal prosecutor, and he also served as a special assistant to Robert Mueller, the man now leading the Russia probe. Also joining us, former CIA Director James Woolsey. He's the former U.S. ambassador to the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty and a former senior advisor to the Trump campaign. Ambassador, let's start with you. Thank you so much for joining us today. If Jeff Sessions has nothing to hide, wouldn't he prefer a public testimony where everyone can see that he's open and direct?
Quite possibly. I got to say, though, this whole thing reminds me of the Mark Twain line about the fellow who jumped on his horse and rode off in all directions at once. The first thing they ought to figure out is what criteria they're using and what they're trying to do. I think that, for example, it would have made some sense in the Oval Office when they were going back and forth about who said what to whom, for Mr. Comey to have suggested that the President's counsel, White House counsel, join them, and they have a three-person discussion so people can understand exactly what criteria are applying where. For example, a requirement, I'm told, by Andy McCarthy, a very fine prosecutor, for any notion of being able to block discussion or to turn away from having a free and open exchange requires corruption. Obstruction of justice, according to Andy, under statute, requires corruption. And there doesn't appear to be any corruption that we can see or have talked about or have been briefed on so far. That could affect the discussion of dealing with any kind of limitation on discussion very substantially. And to have Comey decide after he was sort of one down in the discussion to go off and present the material that he wrote up of a discussion with the president to an old friend and to tell him to go ahead and give it to the press, that doesn't seem to me to be the way you deal with the President of the United States.
So you feel that his response, even when the President asked Jeff Sessions to leave the room, the Vice President and his son-in-law to leave the room, should have been stronger? At that point, he should have intervened and said something?
I think it would have been very reasonable to have, had private discussion first if they want, but at some point to get a couple of fine lawyers, and they had two there, together with the president, have a discussion of how this all works with respect to any kind of block on proceeding in a just and sound manner. I think that one of the things we really need is a pulling together of people in the world of both law enforcement and intelligence, and a discussion of what is needed in order to support the country. The law enforcement folks, I think, have to do their job in a much more disciplined and structured way than we've seen so far. The intelligence people need to call it straight and not be able to be pushed off their position just by somebody in the political side saying, you know, I really wish you'd word it this way. The president has an intelligence advisory board that could probably do something like this, but we need to go back to square one. Neither the intelligence people nor the law enforcement people, I think, are doing a good job here.
Michael, to you now, getting back to Jeff Sessions, to you, does it ultimately matter whether or not he testifies in a public or private setting? What ultimately is the difference?
Well, one, the public gets to hear and observe the Attorney General, and the other one, they don't. I have always favored, when there's no national security or military override, to have people testify in public so that the public can see what's going on here. And I don't understand why, absent a national security imperative or intelligence that has to be protected, why this would ever be considered to be an appropriate closed-door session. I think sunshine on these things is much more preferable to our democracy than closed-door sessions, as I said, except when needed for military or national security purposes.
And staying with you, Michael, do you agree with the ambassador that Comey crossed the line or was inappropriate in passing along that memo to a friend specifically to bring about this special counsel?
Well, we have to split that into two parts. One is, because we've heard used by the president and his surrogates the term leak, that Director Comey leaked this to the media. It is not, technically speaking, a leak. It is not a classified document. It is not an official document of the FBI, in my estimation, not a 302 interview form that was done in the course of a formal investigation. It is his personal recollection, almost a Dear Diary entry. And so I think he has the prerogative to disseminate this as he will. If you're going to ask then the follow-up question of, did he do it in the best way possible? Probably not. I mean, probably it would have been better for him to have done it himself directly. But I think at this point, he was perhaps so shell-shocked by what happened that this seemed to him at the time the most prudent way to accomplish it. But to call it a leak, I think, is improper classification of what it is. And the director knows way more than I what is a classified document and what is subject to leaking. And I don't think this fits those definitions in any way, shape, or form.
Ambassador, you have a response.
Quite correct. I think technically this is not a leak. It wasn't classified. But it was a private write-up of a discussion with the president on a very sensitive and important matter. And the system is not going to work if everybody decides, whenever I have a discussion with the president, I'm going to make sure I go right to the Times or the Post or the Journal or whatever. That's what this says. This says that it's fine to go public with most private discussions with the President of the United States. And that just seems to me to be a recipe for disaster.
So I guess I disagree a little bit with that as a legal proposition. I have no political interest in outcomes here. Mine is just a legal analysis. And if the president believed that the nature of the conversation that he had with Director Comey was one that involved policy determinations which are privileged under the United States versus Nixon, then he should have asserted privilege and not allowed Comey to testify at all. But he didn't do that. And so to say now, after the fact, that the distribution of those memos somehow implicates or even violates the executive privilege that the president is entitled to assert doesn't seem to me availing.
I don't think they violate executive privilege. I think think it's a very bad idea to do what Mr. Comey did, though.
And some people are arguing the fact that the president tweeted about it further complicates the matter. I want to move on to
tweets confuse everything.
They certainly do, especially in this administration.
And they also may constitute a waiver, if you will, if the director's proposition is probably, ideally, it's not good for either party to discuss private conversations in public. Then the shoe fits on each foot, and the president shouldn't be doing it as well, and then complaining about others who try to do the same. So no one has clean hands here.
Sure. Ambassador, I really want to get your perspective on this. We've heard from some Republicans, including Paul Ryan, who say that the president, in his approach to James Comey, they're not outright denying James Comey's account, but they're saying that the president, in his approach, in saying that he hoped this Flynn thing would go away, just didn't know any better, that he didn't understand the protocols when it comes to the president's relationship with the FBI director. Well, what do you make of that?
Well, if Andy McCarthy is right, and I've never known him on a matter like this to be wrong, Comey did not get involved in, or the president didn't get involved in obstruction of justice because there wasn't any corruption associated with it. That's a statutory matter.
But do you think the president should have known better in not staying alone with the FBI director?
I practiced law for 22 years. I haven't been practicing for the last few years, but I didn't know what the criteria were for being able or not being able to use something like this in limiting the use for the purposes that we've been talking about. I think the president and Comey and the White House counsel could have sat down and talked about this a little bit before everybody got on his horse and started riding off in every direction, and help the president understand what the criteria were. I think what he said, from what I've heard now about corruption being required under the statute, doesn't sound to me as if there was any thing done that was wrong, but by Comey, I mean by the president, but let's see, let's examine it.
Michael, very quickly, because we are running out of time, your response to that?
Yeah, there are a couple of things here. First, the communications between the White House and the director of the FBI are clearly set forth in regulation. It is not to be done by the White House unless there's some emergent need for it. It's black and white law. If the president isn't aware of that, that failure is on his White House counsel or his Department of Justice, not on the FBI director. And in fact, the FBI director, when the president tried to have these one-on-one communications with him, told the Attorney General to please make him stop because it's not protocol. With respect to the question of whether or not this is a violation of statutory obstruction of justice, that still remains to be seen. There's a big debate about whether, if the president does something which he has the legal right to do, absent another criminal act, whether he can be indicted for obstruction of justice. We'll see how that plays out over the course of time. But to put anything on Comey as a matter of law because he neglected to tell the President of the United States what the protocol is for the President of the United States to communicate with the FBI director, I don't think is fair to Comey. I think that's on the President and his advisors.
Important to point out, though, that Comey continued taking private calls from the president after telling Jeff Sessions that he shouldn't leave him alone in the room with him. Gentlemen, we are out of time, but we thank you very much for joining us this Sunday. James Woolsey, Michael Zeldin, thank you.